Yeah, it's 1 year to the day since Donald Trump decided to walk away from what the U.S. president dubbed at the time the worst deal ever. And now comes the response to the White House's maximum pressure campaign. Shirley Sitbon has more.
60 days, that's the time Iran is giving its partners in the nuclear deal to find new measures to improve the current agreement. Otherwise, Tehran would gradually start rolling back its commitments.
In the nuclear deal, we agreed to keep the uranium enrichment levels at 3.67. We will stop this commitment and will not keep up with any specified levels anymore.
The authorized level allows Iran to have commercial nuclear facilities. Going beyond that could enable the development of nuclear weapons. That was the whole point of the deal, stopping Iran from having atomic bombs. But since the U.S. dropped out of the agreement, saying it was counterproductive and resumed tough sanctions against Iran, Tehran has suffered economically. It's demanding to be able to sell its oil, something the U.S. has blocked. It also wants to protect its banking sector, stop the drop of its currency, the Iranian rial, which is now trading at more than 153,000 to $1. President Rouhani warns amending the deal is the only way to save it.
So, Sanam Chantier, we're getting two different reactions out of Washington to all of this. On the one hand, there's moves afoot for stepped-up sanctions in the coming days. That's according to senior officials within the Treasury Department. And now you have the U.S. envoy for Iran, Brian Hook. He's given an interview to Saudi-owned Al Arabiya television saying the U.S. wants to negotiate a new deal with Iran.
Also, what we have from the U.S., by their own admission, is what they refer to as a maximum pressure campaign that they're trying to implement. And what that involves is sanctioning Iran, despite the fact that we know that Tehran has complied to the terms of this nuclear agreement as confirmed by the international body, the IAEA, not once, not twice, but 14 times. In addition to that, they have, of course, threatened other countries that continue their business dealings with Iran with punitive measures of their own. They recently considered the IRGC, which is a Revolutionary Guard Corps in the country, as a terrorist organization, and so on and so forth. So that's the first perspective that you're talking about. But I think we have reached a point where a big question comes up amongst us. Is this the end of the deal? And the question that I'd very much be interested to hear from the Iranian perspective is this what Tehran was counting on? Because up until this point, it seems that compliance hasn't really paid off. So did they come to the table, bring this threat, 90 days, to the Americans, to the European partners, to see whether they can deliver and they can commit to their end of the bargain, which up until this point, we haven't seen.
All right, before we cross to Mohammad Morandi in Tehran, let's listen to the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's on a visit to London and who seemed to almost play down the significance of the announcement out of Tehran.
I've seen the reporting, I've seen the letter that's been sent. I think it was intentionally ambiguous. We'll have to wait to see what Iran's actions actually are. They've made a number of statements about actions they threatened to do in order to get the world to jump. We'll see what they actually do. The United States will wait to observe that.
So just to clear the air, Mohammad Morandi, how do you interpret it? What's going to happen in 60 days' time?
Well, two things. In your introduction, it was said that Iran wants to improve or modify the deal. That's not at all what Iran is after. Iran wants the implementation of the deal. Obviously has been in clear violation because it has torn the agreement. Of course, even under Obama, the U.S. was in violation of the agreement, but that's another story. But the European Union, and in particular France, Germany, and Britain, have been in clear violation of the agreement. They have not done anything that they were supposed to do. They've said nice words and made good, nice statements, but in reality, they have been in full violation, in complete violation. And when a French or British official calls on Iran to stay within the framework, I think Iranians find that ridiculous because the French are not abiding by anything, and neither are the British. So the Iranians are saying that we've been abiding by this agreement for years.
Just to be clear
to
on
the
that
letter.
point, how
And,
should the French,
the
in your view, you're saying they're not abiding, how so?
Well, the French, they have commitments under the agreement. One is to reestablish the link between the Iranian banking system with the international banking system, and also to purchase Iranian oil. And there are other commitments as well, but none of them are being carried out. And as I said, it's only been verbal so far. And the Iranians are, the Europeans are saying that we can't do anything about it. We have to abide by Trump's orders and demands because the United States is in control of the financial system. But the Iranians don't buy that. They're saying that the Europeans, they have more than enough leverage. And if they cannot defend their citizens, if they cannot defend their businesses, if they cannot protect their banks and insurance companies, then they shouldn't be at any negotiating table. The Europeans should just simply step aside and say that we are minors and that the United States and Trump will decide for us. And also when the Iranians see how the Europeans jump on the American bandwagon in Venezuela, in Libya, when the Europeans help the Saudis starve the Yemenis, and so on and so forth, that just basically reinforces the image that Europe is not going to do anything that Trump doesn't want them to do. But for the Iranians, they have to make a decision. If the Europeans implement the deal, then the Iranians will ignore the fact that the Americans exited it. But if the Europeans are not going to abide by their side of the bargain, that's very wishful thinking for them to think that Iran is going to continue down the same road as the last year. The Iranians have shown a huge patience over the last year in being the only side in implementing the agreement, but that is not going to continue. The next 60 days is a sort of warning bell to the Europeans that time is running out.
All right, Julien Théron, do you agree with Mohamed Morandi that the French, for instance, could be buying Iranian oil, and that if you're going to be a signatory to this deal, you have to act like a sovereign state and not just follow the U.S.'s lead?
The reintegration of Iranian major business companies is indeed included in the deal. The problem, of course, is that to do so, you have to build some new commercial links with previously banned companies. And in order to do so, well, you have to authorize British and German and French companies to do business with Iran. And a certain number of these companies are actually willing to do so. The problem is that the US did not only retract from the deal, they also threatened these countries or any kind of companies from any countries from major sanctions against doing some business with Iranian companies. So it's not quite a political decision from the three Europeans of what we call the P5+1, meaning this international group backing originally the nuclear deal on Iran, but it is the threat of sanctions, the fear from the companies, and also the political decision which is behind. And it's a little bit hard because you know that the Europeans try to implement a kind of black box, a kind of mechanism, institutional mechanism, a complex one, in order to allow the European companies to do some business actually.
Yeah, by doing business without using US dollars.
Indeed, that's one of the key parts, and it is very complicated technically, internationally, and even politically, because it means that, for instance, if you take the headquarters of this mechanism in your country, you might expect some fury from Washington, right?
Yeah, and on Tuesday in Brussels, Iranian and European officials met to again discuss this mechanism called INSTEX, a new financial body that had been set up by Paris, Berlin, and London to, as Julien was saying, enable EU companies to continue to do business with Iran despite the sanctions. But over in Vienna, a U.S. Treasury official pouring cold water on the concept of INSTEX.
I question how that's even remotely possible. Again, with a country like Iran, where the IRGC is so endemic within the economy, but also hidden in many different respects.
So, Matt Brodsky, it's not just that the U.S. is walking away from the Iran deal, is that it's obliging the entire rest of the world to follow its lead?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is the Iran deal, to begin with, doesn't address the problem it was supposed to deal with. And that is, of course, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It instead provides a patient pathway to get there once all these restrictions wear off. So all of the talk about trying to keep Iran inside of a deal that doesn't actually work, and that is pretty nonsensical from the Trump administration's viewpoint and from most Americans' viewpoints. Now, this was clear to a lot of people who were saying this back in 2015 when the deal was being finalized. But we know now from the archives that were taken out by the Mossad from Tehran a little while ago through independent research conducted on that, we know far more than we did back in 2015 about Iran's previous military dimensions of its project. All of these things were previously not declared. They're beyond the scope of what the IAEA can look at, and this deal doesn't even address that. And again, this deal was horrible to begin with before we even knew any of this. So the idea of fixing the deal is ridiculous from Washington's perspective. Now, the fact is, for Europe to be giving
so hang
a
on,
lifeline
you're not even in favor of
for
renegotiating
Iran.
a new deal? You're in favor of just no deal at all?
No, a new deal absolutely can be struck from the beginning, and we throw out everything that's already been done, and then we have a discussion on that. But the idea that what we're trying to do is reapproximate or tinker around the edges with something that just does not work at all doesn't make any sense. Washington and the Trump administration is not going to do that, and that's the point here. The maximum pressure campaign is designed to give Tehran the really difficult choice that it has so far not had to make. And of course, Secretary of State Pompeo laid out 12 points, which is to essentially say that the regime in Tehran merely needs to act like a normal, adult, responsible country, and then there wouldn't be such a problem. But again, this is not what they're looking to do. So again, the United States, Israel, and other countries have said that they're not going to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. So the whole game here on the sidelines of trying to throw an economic lifeline, why is Iran going to try to pull out of the nuclear deal? It was so good for them, the benefits that they get, because they still get to make progress toward a nuclear weapon.
That's not what the International Atomic Energy Agency says. They say that Iran's been complying with the terms of the agreement.
Right. First of all, the IAEA doesn't know what it doesn't know. The IAEA, basically to fast track to get to the deal being signed in 2015, decided that it wouldn't try to substantiate what the previous military dimensions of Iran's program were. So now, of course, we're only learning that through the archives that the Mossad picked up from Tehran. So it doesn't, the blind spot that it has is completely out of this world. And that's aside from the fact that IAEA inspectors themselves have actually said that they really aren't going to be asking to look into many suspect sites where they already know what Iran is going to say, if Iran is going to say no. So, and that's aside from the fact that the process for actually then taking a look at what's inside of these sites and the dispute mechanism is equally ridiculous. And of course, we must add to it, none of the military sites where Iran conducts any of this type of research is actually covered by the agreement. So what the IAEA knows is maybe 1% of a thing, when really the rest of the world should be worried about 99%.
Sanam Chantier.
159-page agreement. 5 annexes. What do we have included in that? What the world powers, we have to remember, Matt, that this is not a bilateral agreement, it's a unilateral agreement between Tehran and the world powers, as our colleague here said in the studio, the P5+1 group. What was agreed under that was for Iran to scale back its nuclear program so that instead of several months, it would take the country an entire year to yield enough material to produce a nuclear bomb. They filled some of their sites with concrete. And this is an important point to make, even though you disagree with the IAEA. This is an international body that was previously, prior to the deal being clinched in 2015, approved by all the member players. And so they have been conducting rigorous inspections inside the country, sending inspectors. This is unprecedented, and François, you have to remember, no other country has been exposed to this kind of rigorous inspection other than Tehran before the JCPOA was clinched. And something that often comes to the equation, we hear, certainly from those that are anti the Iran deal, those that want regime change. However, where you want to look at it is they start discussing the country's regional behaviors, which indeed are questionable. We're talking about Iran propping the regime of Bashar al-Assad, its involvement in Yemen, Hezbollah, what have you. The point is, there's a problem of trust here, and this goes back to the 50s when there was a coup d'etat against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh at the time, and it continues to date. Washington didn't deliver its end of the bargain. How do you expect the Iranians are going to come to the negotiating table and negotiate JCPOA round 2?
All right, what happens next? We'll talk about it when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're talking on the day when Iran is effectively given the other signatories of the 2015 nuclear agreement 60 days to get back on board. Otherwise, it'll start revamping its nuclear program as before. With us to talk about it, Associate Professor Mohammad Marandi of the University of Tehran. Welcome back as well to Matt Brodsky, Senior Fellow at the Security Studies Group, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Julien Théron, who lectures at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, and France 24's Sanam Chantier. Last month you had the Iranian foreign minister in New York, Mohammad Javad Zarif, asked in a panel discussion if Donald Trump wants a renegotiation of the Iran deal or regime change.
Depending on whose aim? President Trump's aim is to bring us to our knees to talk. B team wants regime change at the very least. They want disintegration of Iran as their objective.
Tell me again who's in the B team.
Bibi, Bolton, bin Zayed, bin Salman.
Yeah, the leaders of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and John Bolton, Donald Trump's national security advisor. Let me ask you, Matt Brodsky, do you agree with Foreign Minister Zarif that Donald Trump, yeah, he'd be up for a renegotiation, but the others want regime change?
I think if there can be a deal that's reached from the bottom up from the beginning that actually works and prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and addresses its rogue behavior, then I think that can be done. But I mean, on the other hand, let's be clear: a regime that exports terror, that is responsible for helping to kill some 500,000 in Syria, and is creating trouble throughout the region, wants to have a nuclear weapon, has a undeclared military purpose for that nuclear program. And the question is whether the United States or whether Israel or some of the Arab neighbors in the region would be shedding a tear if the regime were to fall. What about all the people who are in Iran who have been protesting on the streets for well over a year now of the conditions, of course, because they disagree with the Iranian regime? So I don't think many people would shed a tear if such a tyrannical regime that again is pursuing nuclear weapons were to fall. But again, that's not America's declared policy. It is to renegotiate a deal, but certainly it is not to reward this regime as we have been doing with this nuclear with the nuclear deal. We don't need to pay for that.
All right, let me ask Mohammad Marandi on this. In the end, is it going to finish with a return to the bargaining table?
No, Iran is not going to negotiate with the regime in Washington because it is a discredited regime that does not abide by the commitments that its own previous governments have made. So it's not worthy of having any new discussions with. If Iran were to negotiate with Trump, that would be appeasement. And appeasement simply does not work. What your American guest was saying, of course, was untrue. And he's basically taking the Israeli Mohammed bin Salman Bolton position. And the reality on the ground is the International Atomic Energy Agency knows very well what's going on in Iran and with regards to the Iranian nuclear program. And the Israeli regime has not provided any new information whatsoever, and that is something that the International Atomic Energy Agency has said repeatedly. And to say that the IAEA knows 1% of what's going on in Iran is beyond bizarre. But having said that, what I'd like to point out is that the Iranians, with regards to the situation in the region, that was not a part of the negotiations. And in fact, the very fact that the United States has shown itself to be unreliable and has discredited itself by leaving the agreement and by bullying other countries into abiding by its demands shows that Iran cannot trust the United States in negotiating not only on other issues but on the nuclear program. So how can Iran negotiate with the United States over any other issue, such as Syria or Yemen, when the United States cannot commit itself to what it has signed upon? But with regards to the region, let's look at the facts on the ground and see how much trust there should be between Iran and the United States. The United States helped murder over 500,000 Syrians by supporting ISIS. Look at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, which is partially released. Your viewers can check it online. It says specifically that the U.S. allies in the region supported the extremists, and those extremists, those Salafists, wanted to establish a state between Syria and Iraq. And that is exactly what happened. Later on, the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency at that time,
all right,
General Michael
yes,
Flynn,
and the similar charge has been leveled against Bashar al-Assad,
admitted,
emptying the prisons so that the radicals can get out. So let's not go into a Syria debate. Let's stay on the issue, Mohammed, which is Iran.
No, if you're no, excuse me. This is the issue. What you said is absolutely not true. And your American guest was able to make all sorts of accusations, and you let him go on, and you gave him a second turn. So let me reply to his accusations. Your American guest, his government, has been helping the Saudis starve the people of Yemen for years. And your government, by the way, is involved in this mass murder.
This is your proxy war.
Your government along with Americans, has been involved in destroying Libya. So I think it's very hypocritical for anyone in the United States or Europe to talk about human rights when you're helping to destroy the economy in Venezuela in order to overthrow a government, when you're trying to strangle the people of Yemen to bring them to their knees if
I could address the issue of
Mohammed
trusting
bin Salman,
the United States that he was talking about,
cuts up people
I would like to answer that position.
All right, gentlemen.
When the United States behaves like that, the Iranians cannot trust the U.S. regime. So unless the European Union comes back and implements what they have promised to implement, there is no room for further negotiations. We cannot negotiate over anything else when we cannot have that which we have negotiated implemented.
All right, let me bring in Julien Thérault on this. Julien, there were some uncomfortable moments, by the way, Tuesday at the French National Assembly because of a ship going out to Saudi Arabia with weapons to be sold, should be said. Look, this Wednesday we heard the French defense minister raise the specter that if Iran does walk away from the deal, then yes, France will be among the nations reimposing sanctions. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to say a couple of things after what we've seen. The first thing is that, yes, it's a deal. Even the Obama administration, that it was not the best deal. We have to know what it is, a deal. A deal is between sometimes conflicting parties, and it is a consensus, meaning that you don't obtain everything you want. So Donald Trump is not wrong when he says that it's not the best deal for the Americans. Indeed, it's not the best deal for the Americans, it's not the best deal for the Iranians. It's a deal between two conflicting parties. So they struck a deal. another deal possible. We have just seen the Iranians are not ready to do so. And we are speaking at a time where the Iranian government is considered in Iran as a moderate and not as radical one and with the conservatives, meaning that any kind of alternative within the regime would not be possible technically. I mean, they would definitely refuse. So that's a part. I mean, that was a deal, maybe not a perfect deal for every party, but that's the idea of a deal, actually. The other idea is that if there was any kind of intelligence about the non-compliance of Iran in front of the deal and so on, which is a possibility, and it's such a possibility that it's actually included in the deal. And it's said in the deal that in this case, any of the parties, including at the time the US, could have called for a UNSC meeting and present intelligence pieces that Iran was not complying with the deal. And in this respect, I join you saying the IAEA actually always said that Iran was complying with this.
Add a very small point to that. In addition to that, European officials, if you agree, Julien, have acknowledged the fact that if other parties are seen to be violating the JCPOA, then the other side has every right to withdraw. For the US case, it would be a snapback of sanctions, which has already happened despite Iran's compliance. And for Iran is essentially to resume its nuclear program. It's not for now, it's just saying several parts we're going to renege on the commitments that we made.
Yes, and I would like to
but on this issue then of France saying that it might reimpose sanctions.
We are strictly in the middle of two very complicated political situations, actually. So we have to deal with some choices, and it's very hard for the moment to know, because we are facing a wall. What is this wall made of? In one hand, the political position of what Mike Pompeo's doctrine, more or less, on Iran is called maximum pressure. What does it mean? It means putting maximum pressure, not only on Iran, like you said, but also on the Europeans, on Russia, on China, in order to strike another deal, which will be, like I said, very complicated, or possibly facing military actions. I mean, indeed, this is always a possibility. John Bolton was already in George W. Bush's team saying that Iran was in the axis of evil and so on. So the Bolton-Pompeo side is putting pressure. The problem with that is that at a time where you put pressure, sometimes the pressure is so hot that actually you face a war. The other, and it's what we see with the new naval group coming in the Gulf and so on, in the Persian Gulf. On the other hand, we have a more or less moderate president called Hassan Rouhani and his minister Zarif, who tried to reintegrate Iran in the international community, striking a deal and so on. And at the end, it didn't work. So they are under pressure from the hardliner inside the regime, meaning the IRGC, and their network in the whole region. So both ways are actually heating up under
pressure
political
from the hardliners. You have a deal that's not working. One side is not delivering its end of the bargain.
True, but Rouhani could still defend it.
But
and
even our
chose
colleague
to
in Washington
actually put a
talked
little
about
pressure
the discontent that there is
on
in
the
country
Europeans
at the moment. There were previously some scattered protests across the country because people are unhappy about the state of the economy. 50% inflation. You have 20-something% unemployment rate. There is mismanagement. There are levels of corruption. But the point is, and this is what I'd love to hear from Matt, has he ever been to Iran? I would love to hear whether you've ever spoken to people inside the country, because as much as they may be unhappy with what's currently going on with the administration, the last thing they want is someone like John Bolton, who has the support of the Mujahedin Khalq, a former terrorist organization, to come and call for regime change. I mean, when I was in Iran where the nuclear deal was clinched, the one thing, Francois, that united Iranian people, whether they are pro or against this current establishment, was finally we have some hope.
Matt Brodsky, your thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah, first of all, the imaginary divide between this hardline and moderate in Iranian leadership doesn't exist. That's fake. And I'm sure everyone likes to tell themselves that they exist, these fictional moderate characters, so that it's better, it's easier to then to sell the deal to themselves.
So you're saying Hassan Rouhani's the same as Ahmadinejad, his predecessor?
I'm saying that it doesn't really matter what the language is that they're using. What matters is what they do. And if you look at Rouhani's domestic his domestic policies and you look at what he's done abroad, and specifically if you look at what Iran's policies have been in implementation across the region since 2011, yeah, they've been far more harsh than they were even under Ahmadinejad. But that's neither here nor there. We have to understand also, when we're talking about the trusting of the United States, the weird thing is Senator Tom Cotton, one of our senators, wrote a letter to Khamenei as the deal was being signed, saying specifically, in our American system, we have to have treaties in which Congress works out. In other words, if you sign this deal, we will not honor it. He was right to do so, and he actually got a lot of blowback politically for doing that during this negotiation. But the way the American system of government works is when you have such a deal like this, it is considered a treaty, and there's a legal process that goes through in the United States. That's why we do it, because one's hands would be tied as president to get us, we wouldn't be able to walk away from a deal. So this is why if a new deal is structured, and Democrats were on board and Republicans were on board, then that would be something that would be sealed, and then it could be trustworthy. But again, Iran was warned about this, as was the rest of the international community. And the fact is, we're not interested in the United States, at least in the Trump administration, in trying to patch up holes on a sinking, broken ship. It doesn't make any sense.
All right, it's going a bit further than that right now. Oil prices, well, they were down after the announcement out of Tehran earlier. Markets making sense of news. China's crude oil imports in April unexpectedly surged to a record high. State-run refiners building up stocks of Iranian crude oil, anticipating a sanctions clampdown, a clampdown that's set to go up a notch in the coming days. The Trump administration has said an announcement is coming. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported plans for new sanctions on banks and businesses with an aim to choking off trade, including Iranian petrochemical sales to Singapore and consumer goods sales to Afghanistan. Mohammad Moranti, what's next right now for the Iranian economy?
Well, contrary to what your guest in the United States has been saying, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a very diverse political system. If you look at polls carried out by American institutions, in fact, academic institutions, it has a very high degree of legitimacy, and it is the only country that in this region that is not that's in the Persian Gulf region, alongside Iraq, that has elections that are meaningful with high turnouts. And the regimes, whether it's Israel, which is an apartheid regime, or Saudi Arabia, which is a dictatorship controlled by one person, and the same with the United Arab Emirates, those are allies of the United States. So like the hardliners and fanatical people like Cotton, which he mentioned, the Senator of the United States, actually once said that the United States, when he was complaining about the U.S. role in Syria, was saying that the U.S. is playing the role of the Air Force for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So that aside, I think that as the United States pushes
because we're short on time, so just the question, Mohammad Moranti, about
I didn't interrupt your American guest, so he should show some toleration. I think that's the difference between Iran and the United States, that the United States is a godfather regime which dictates its terms to the rest of the world, and they don't allow anyone else to have a voice. And on rare occasions when an Iranian does speak, they have to stop him from speaking. So, yes, that's what your regime carried out in Syria by supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So, but what the key point that I want to make here is that the United States, by pushing for confrontation, and especially doing so with the Saudi and Emirati regime, it is forcing Iran to move towards pushback. The Saudi regime and the Emirati regime are particularly vulnerable because they are trying to impose an economic warfare against Iranians. And by doing that, they're going to force Iran to make the road ahead for these two countries much more bumpy. There is serious talk in Iran of carrying out stop and searches on ships, cargo ships, oil tankers going to and from Emirati and Saudi ports. And you have to keep in mind that the Iranians know quite well, that the Americans know quite well, that if there is war in the Persian Gulf, and that is something that the Iranians do not want, that's why they signed the nuclear deal, because to destroy the American narrative and to bring back stability to this region. But if the Americans want to push for confrontation, then the Americans know quite well that Iran has built underground cities, tunnels across the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And if there is war, there will be no oil. Forget the Strait of Hormuz. That's a sideshow. There will be no oil and gas anymore in the Persian Gulf and coming from the Persian Gulf. So the United States will be responsible for creating a global economic depression unlike anything that we've seen in the last century. So the smart thing for the Americans to do is to behave more reasonably, stop behaving like a godfather, stop trying to strangle ordinary Iranians and try to make them suffer by preventing Iranians from even importing medicine, and to return to the negotiating table.
You guys are
and to
offering
accept
to
the
actually
nuclear deal.
send medicine
And then, remember,
to
the
Venezuela.
Americans left
Don't
the nuclear.
complain about
the
the lack of medical
Americans
supplies.
left the negotiating
You're apparently
table.
willing to prop up the regime
Your
of
regime
Venezuela.
is the
In
regime
your
that
own
is
media,
trying
you
to
carry
make
stories that
ordinary
you're willing to
Venezuelans
send
suffer.
medicine to
Your
Venezuela.
regime
I'd like to get in on
destroyed
this
Libya.
argument.
Your regime is imposing starvation. You are an intolerant, your regime is intolerant, and again, you are behaving like the leaders of your regime. You don't have
Obviously,
a monopoly
the viewers will
over
decide. I
the
don't think
conversation.
it's
Gentlemen,
easy to win
gentlemen,
a
just
debate.
because we're running short on time, Sanam Chantier, we heard mentioned there the tension over the Strait of Hormuz. That's where 30% of the world's seaborne oil is transported across. There was quite a bit of saber rattling at the start of the week with the deployment of the USS Abraham Lincoln talked about.
Wait, the latter that you just mentioned, we're not terribly concerned about because this has happened before. We had a similar carrier in the Persian Gulf back in April for several weeks, François.
How much should we pay attention to the saber
Well,
rattling?
I think we've reached, it's all or nothing. From what I'm understanding from my conversations from those that are very close to the Iranian establishment for the time being, they have nothing to lose, and that's why they are willing to send this message. That's why they've provided a deadline. The only thing, I have very little hope for the JCPOA as it stands, as someone who covered it for almost a decade. What I can say to you is, and this is my hope for diplomacy, as we can say, putting my editorial hat on here, Javad Zarif, you mentioned, was in New York last week. He had an interview with Fox News, rather unprecedented for an Iranian official to do so, spoke directly to Donald Trump, saying, let's open up some sort of a channel of communication. Let's talk about prisoner exchanges. Only hope left here is that the two sides somehow put this behind them and get around the negotiating table, putting aside everything that we're discussing, whether it's to do with Iran's regional behavior, just to actually manage to once again go back to trying to curb back Iran's nuclear program.
Julien Theron, right now, I read one comment out of Washington that there are no diplomatic back channels between Iran and the United States. Do you believe that?
Well, I think that even antagonist parties always talk, so that's not
So that's
a problem.
not quite true.
But it doesn't mean that they are in a situation to strike a deal. It doesn't mean that. In this respect, there's a military escalation that might be downgraded to a minor risk, indeed, because it happened before. If there was some kind of diplomatic window to go through, and I'm afraid that, as far as we've seen tonight, actually, the diplomatic situation is pretty blocked, and pressures and discourses are actually going on, and it will be very hard for the Europeans to impose themselves. It's their chance, but it's going to be hard in facing both challenges, actually.
All right, it's going to be hard facing both challenges, and as we were mentioning, there is the issue of what the ordinary Iranians make of it all. They're certainly feeling the pinch, a $10 billion shortfall in oil revenues because of the sanctions so far, according to the Trump administration, food prices that have nearly doubled in the past year, and a deep recession that's hitting hard.
It's very difficult for the people, very difficult. When people can't afford even milk and dates, what are they supposed to eat? You go to bed, and when you wake up, prices have been raised 10 times.
What'll be the plan if more sanctions are indeed announced later this week, Mohammed Marandi?
Well, I'm sure there will be more sanctions declared by the United States, but I think the Iranians have decided that it's time for pushback. And since the Saudi and Emirati regimes are helping the United States carry out this economic warfare against ordinary Iranians, then I think they should expect the blowback. And if I were an investor in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, or if I had money there, I'd begin thinking about taking it somewhere more safe. But the Iranians are selling a lot more oil than is being declared. Remember, during the Obama sanctions, which were very similar, they were also targeting ordinary Iranians. Back then, the Iranians, it was declared by many commentators that the Iranians were exporting between 800,000 to 1 million barrels a day. And only after the nuclear deal was signed did Iranian government officials come out and actually admit that Iran was actually exporting almost 2 million barrels a day. And as we speak, the same is happening. The Iranians are exporting a very large amount of oil on the high seas at a discount apparently of something like $4 a barrel. And since Iranian oil is very cheap to produce, it doesn't really hurt Iran that much. And also, I think countries like China are going to resist the United States. But as I said, the Iranians will begin to push back, and I think that if the Iranians begin stop-and searches, and they will do it under the justification that Mohammed bin Salman last year said that he's going to take the war into Iran. And then after that, we had the ISIS terrorist attacks in Tehran. We had the extremist attack in Baluchistan near the Pakistani border, and near the Persian Gulf in Ahvaz. We also had terrorist attacks. So the Iranians are going to use
just a straight, because we're out of time, Mohammed Morandi. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I'm gonna have to unfortunately cut you off. So much more to ask about. I want to thank you so much for joining us from Tehran. I want to thank very much Matt Brodsky for being with us from Washington, D.C. Julien Theron, Sanam Chantier, thank you for being with us here.